Okay. You can hear me well, right? Cool. Okay. Thank you for coming. I know it's a Friday, last session on the last day of a conference. I really appreciate that you are here with me. I will talk about how to manage Microsoft Azure Infrastructure Services with Windows PowerShell desired state configuration. It's a really, really long title if I didn't use abbreviations, right? So my name is Aleksandar Nikolic. I'm a PowerShell MVP for Windows PowerShell. I'm also owner of Mosaic IT Consulting Company, co-founder of PowerShellMagazine.com and a community manager of PowerShell.com. You can find me on Twitter at username Aleksandar. So let's start first with desired state configuration. You already probably heard introduction session delivered by Yannick Lering, right? If you are not, then we will just spend a little bit of time explaining the basics of desired state configuration and then move to demos. Demos are much more interesting, really. So desired state configuration is a new configuration management platform that Microsoft is developing. It enables a deployment of configuration data to your target nodes, and it's also capable of fixing a configuration drift if it happens. Not by default, but you can set it that way. The main change here compared to PowerShell scripts as we know it is a different approach to a problem. So we have that declarative versus imperative approach. We think here about what we want instead of how to get it, right? So with imperative approach, if you want to install web server, you will think, okay, I need to find a commandlet, like install Windows feature, the name of that feature, and then the feature will be installed. Here you explain that you want on particular server a feature web server to be present, and that's it. You don't care how that will happen. You don't care about commandlets that will really execute that action. So why desired state configuration? And why now? First thing is that there are some configuration management systems on, and technologies in a Linux world, and things are really changing now fast, and we don't have time anymore to do this, all things manually. Even with the simple automation, we need better things for configuring systems. Historically, we have a kind of a problem to, it was difficult to automate and configure Windows machines. Compared to Unix machines or Linux machines, the difference is that they are document-based configurations there, right? So when they need to configure things, they practically manage text files. With Windows, we need to deal with the APIs, with so many different APIs. So practically, what we will get with the desired state configuration is a kind of an abstraction layer on top of all that. So we will not care about underlying APIs. We will just care about the state that we want on our target nodes. This is all connected to the rise of the DevOps movement. You see that, you hear that word a lot lately in the last 2 years. There's a lot of people that are not even, they don't know what it is and what you can do with it. There is that some kind of special tools that we will need to use. Is that a culture? Is that there is a lot of things around it, but one thing is for sure that we need a robust and uniform automation. When we talk about that, we need a rapid provisioning of a system. We don't have time anymore. For example, developers don't have a time anymore to wait for operation guys to create the infrastructure for them so that they can develop and test things. It should be available to them to build those test environments in a controlled way, but we don't have time anymore to to wait for all those things. We need to make them much faster. And at the beginning of when DSC started, then people said, like, why Microsoft is now developing something that will compete with technologies that are already there, that are already mature. And people start talking like, okay, DSC versus Chef, versus Puppet, Docker, Ansible, all those technologies. The point is, it's not versus, it's and. DSC with all those other things. Okay? We're not competing against them. We will work together to make the life of all the IT guys easier. So what are the goals when you work with desired state configuration? You can see this statement a lot, like calling infrastructure as a code, right? So when we think about configurations that we want as something that can be at some point put in a versioning system, right? So you will have kind of, I really like this quote that I found on, I think on Twitter, that configuration management is an executable documentation. You remember before we started automating stuff, when you needed to document some processes, you need to take lots of those screenshots, right? To create those very long Word documents with lots of steps and lots of screenshots and lots of those things, and people still made a mistake with it, right? But now, when we think about that declarative approach to a problem, we will have a, let's say, a code that can be executable, really, because, and in the same way, you will have all the things documented. So if there is a problem, you can easily spot the problem there, because it doesn't depend really on a manual process, on someone who just missed one step in those 20 steps to configure something. Another good feature of desired state configuration is that it's completely based on standards. So the protocol that it's used is WSMan. It's an industry standard. It's not Microsoft standard or something that Microsoft took as a standard and then changed it a little to make it more Microsoft standard, right? Microsoft doesn't do that anymore. He really aggressively even pushes others to follow all the industry standards now. So DSC is based on WSMan, on SIM, and OMI when you think about a Linux side of a story. So what we want to get at the end is universal automation of heterogeneous environment. Because we don't have, as they call shops, that are only based on Microsoft or only on Linux, right? Usually you have enterprises with a mixed environments. But you don't want, when you manage things, you don't want to think about those differences, right? Because if you need to think about them all the time, then your life is not easy at all. We have two different models for working with DSC, but I will here today during this session focus only on a push model, because I will use that one for working with Azure Infrastructure Resources. So we can look at the push model in those three phases, like authoring, staging, and then the stage when we apply a configuration. So in the first one, in the authoring phase, we can use a PowerShell to create a document file, or we can use a third-party languages and tools. So it depends really on vendors if they will create those. I mean, you don't need to use a PowerShell at the end to create the declarative document, the MOV file, which is also a standard managed object format file. It's not created by Microsoft, it's an industry standard. So once when we have that MOV file, we need to apply that configuration that it contained in a MOV file on our target nodes using a DSC agent there, or local management, okay, whatever. I cannot remember the name of it right now. So I will show you a demo. How can we use a push model first to configure a local machine, and then later how to do that with an Azure machine. The process is practically the same at some point when we establish a connection between a local machine, a client machine that we are using for administrating, and the Azure machine. So the first thing is, when we work with Azure resources, we need to configure our environment so that we can authenticate to Azure subscription. There are a few things that we need to do so we can work with Azure resources. One is to download and install Azure PowerShell commandlets. They are part of a module. The latest version is 08.13. Then we can authenticate using a publish settings file that contains the certificate info, or we can authenticate using Azure Active Directory. For this case, because I will use a DSC, I will have kind of both authentications. One with the publish settings file for working with the DSC resource, and I will use Active Directory authentication for my own user account that is currently logged on to this machine. Also, during the demo, when I will use a DSC resource to configure a machine, I will use experimental Azure DSC resources created by Microsoft that exposes a few of the DSC resources that we can use for managing infrastructure services. Here in line 9, you can see the very easy way to install that additional DSC resource that I need if I have PowerShell 5 preview on machine. Microsoft is really working hard to make all that things of working with the modules and getting them from public PowerShell gallery very easy. So what you need to do is practically to run find module x Azure and pipe that to install module, and you will get that module installed on your machine. Also, what I did already is I securely stored my credentials on disk so that I don't need to type them all the time during the demos. They are written there, encrypted on a file system in a file, so I will use them during the demo. There is one really important thing to know if you work with DSC and Azure, that you need to have, as I mentioned, like 2 different authentications. You need to have one authentication for your currently logged user, and you have to have authentication for a local system account. Why? Because DSC runs under a local system account. How can you check if all those things are working properly? You need to start a command line as a system account and then check it there. If you want it, I will give you that code a little bit later. So let me check if I have everything configured already, or do I need to authenticate. So I can see that my Azure Pass subscription is there. I have a storage account properly configured, and everything is fine. Here on a screen, you can see that we have 2 different paths for information that contains the certificates. If I used certificate for this one, I will have it here for my own Aleksandar account, but for a system one, I have it in a system profile. So you can see here that I have in Windows System 332 config system profile app data roaming Windows Azure PowerShell path, a JSON file that contains information for authenticating a local system account to Azure subscription. I will not show you the content of it because I don't want to share with the world later when they share presentation all the information about this subscription. But believe me, it's there. So how can you start your PowerShell as a local system? If you need to check a few things, you can use psexec -s-i and start PowerShell that way, so you can look at the subscription there and check if it's already configured properly. So in my first demo, I will create a DSC configuration that will download few tools, few sysinternals tools on my local machine, and then I will download them as well on an Azure VM. That's the goal of the first demo. I have here sysinternals for members. This is how I call the script that I can show you how it looks like. It has a configuration that imports another experimental Azure DSC resource that contains a resource for downloading files from the internet. If my servers have a role member, then I will apply this configuration to them. So for this thing, I will use a separation between the structural data and environmental data. So we'll have configuration data that contains information really about my servers, the name and their role. And here I will just have defined the resources that I want to apply. So the first thing is that I want all of them to have a destination path that I will use to put those sysinternals tools in. And then I will download tools from sysinternals using xremote file resource. Here in the configuration data file, you can see further how I practically marked some of the servers as members in case that maybe one of those servers that I have can be a domain controller. I don't want those tools there. So here with the node name star, I said like, okay, apply this to every single server. But for this one, I marked that localhost is a member, and the tools that I want are autoruns and psexec. And for this one that it's in a cloud, in Azure, I also want those two. But if I want later to add another tools, I will just change a configuration data here without touching my configuration, really. Because configuration will be dynamically created. So let's go back to demo steps. So I will now run sysinternals script with the configuration using the data from configuration data file. As a result, I will get two more files, one for my local machine and one for my Azure VM machine. If we look at the MOV file, for the local machine, you will see here that we have definition for configuration of a sysinternals demo folder that I will use as a target. And then I have one for section for one tool, autoruns, and then I have another one for psexec. Okay. I will then apply that MOV file to my local system using start DSC configuration commandlet. Right now I'm downloading stuff from sysinternal site. The folder was created first. Everything is done. And now if I look at the content of this new sysinternals demo folder, I can see that I got those two files. So this is how you use DSC and apply DSC configuration locally on a machine. So let's try to do the same thing on Azure. This is like ad hoc usage of a DSC with working with Azure VMs. So what I need to know to reference to my Azure VM, I need to know a service name and the name of Azure VM. So demo DSC SVC is the name of my service. Test VM1 is the name of machine. I have this nice get Azure WinRM URI commandlet that comes with Azure PowerShell module that will give me a link, information about the connection URI so that I can connect to Azure VM. You see, if I look at, because I assign it to a variable, if I look there, you have all the information about ports and paths and all those things. So the self-signed certificate is used on Azure VM to enable PowerShell remoting over HTTPS. So I have two ways to work around that. I can download certificate from Azure VM and put it on my local certification store, or I can use new SIM session option and skip the CA check. Mark also that I will use SSL. When I have that part, I need the credentials. I already have a credential just to check. Aleksandar is here, okay? So now I need to establish new SIM session to my Azure VM. I have all the needed parts, a port, a URI, session option, and now I have a session in a variable CS. If I look at it, see, everything is fine. And now I can use the same start DSC configuration, but instead of specifying computer name, I'm specifying a SIM session. And I will apply a same configuration to the Azure VM. So you see that things are going there. The folder was created, and then the files downloaded. So I can check the content, and if everything is okay, if I don't trust the verbose output here. So I will now create a PowerShell session to establish interactive connection, interactive PS session to my Azure VM and to check the status there. I will use new PS session option and then create a PowerShell session targeting my Azure VM and create interactive session to it. When I create interactive session to my Azure VM, you see that the prompt now changes to a name of a service, to the URL that points to a cloud service, because when you create Azure VM, it's put in a cloud service. You can look at the cloud service as a kind of a container, like a boundary for all the VMs that you put, but this is the case when I put just one VM in that cloud service. So everything when I type now is the same as I type it really like interactively logged on to that machine. So I will go now to sysinternals demo folder on Azure VM, look at the content, and I can see those two files already there. So the configuration worked and files are there. So let me now remove one of the files and see how can we fix that. So by default, local configuration manager, LCM, that's the one that I wanted to mention before, is configured to apply and monitor, not to correct drifts. So we need to change that. To do that, I need to create a special kind of a configuration just to set the settings for local configuration manager, and I will change only the property of configuration mode to apply and autocorrect. I will run this configuration, get a MOV file for local configuration manager, and then change the settings of it so that now is set to apply and autocorrect. You can see it here. Configuration mode is now apply and autocorrect. I don't want to wait for consistency check, but just to see how it's configured. We have a scheduled task called consistency that will take care of that, and I can assign it to a task variable here and look at the actions. So what will really happen when you run, when that scheduled task is executed, this command is run. So you will run a PowerShell and then invoke sim command method using this namespace for desired state configuration. But let's see how often it will run, and it will run every 15 minutes. Okay? Because I don't want to wait for it, I can just force it with get scheduled task and the name consistency and pipe that to start scheduled task so that the configuration drift will be fixed. If I look now at the content of a folder, I will see that ps exec.exe is returned back. Okay? So this is the way how you autocorrect changes in a state of your machine. Any questions? Yep. With installation of PowerShell 4 or WMF, Windows Management Framework 4, you will get PowerShell 4 and you will get 12 desired state configuration resources with it. But the revolution really started when the PowerShell team and other product groups started releasing DSC Resource Kits with additional resources to support different products and different configurations, different resources. So the one that we will focus on is Azure, but you can see we have lots of them. I think that the actual number right now is around 138 or something like that. We had in November or December wave 9. We are waiting eagerly for wave 10, that we will get additional resources. So I will show you now how to work with this Azure resource to create your VM. Before I start explaining, because this is a little bit long execution, I will start it immediately, and then I will try to talk around this. Okay. So the first part is that I will execute one script that contains all the things, and it will finish like in 2 to 3 minutes. But then after that, because I'm also executing a custom script, we will need to wait for like 10 minutes for all that process to finish, because I will install a lot of things there. But let's look at the content of a create PS1. What's really happening here? So this is a script to fully configure your test VM, to put it properly in a cloud service, to create a storage account, because you need storage account to put a VHD file there. And for all those things, we have resources that are part of Azure DSC resource. So the first thing that we need to configure here is a subscription. So we have Azure subscription resource. I want it to be present. So here I need to specify the name of my subscription and a path to that publish settings file that I've downloaded previously that contains information about certificate. So when this configuration is applied to a system, I will get my local system account authenticate to Azure subscription, so that I can work with Azure commandlets with local system account. As I mentioned before, why? Because all the DSC commands are running under local system. This is really not needed before, but I just keep it here as a kind of a reference. We needed before to use affinity groups first, so that we can put things later inside of that. But we don't need to do that anymore. We have regional networks now. And but I still keep it here. And you can see one of the interesting things here is that it's dependent on previous resource, right? We need first to have that subscription defined so that we can continue. And we have control on that using a property depends on. I will just go quickly to this towards the end of a script so that you can see the configuration data that I'm using through all these resources. So here I defined that the node name will be localhost, right? That Azure VM will be targeted directly, so I will not use here the name of Azure machine. It's a local host. Then I will allow a plain text password for it. Affinity group. The interesting thing, in a variable instance, we will have some manipulation of the output of get data to get the last 10 ticks of it so that we can be sure that that name is completely unique worldwide. We don't want our script to break just because we picked the name that it's already in use. I will put it in West Europe. Also, because the storage name needs to be unique, I will use the same kind of a trick here. And I have a script extensions file property. It points to a folder on my system with that name. So all the script files that I will put in that folder will be uploaded to Azure VM. And later I have control and say, like, okay, I want of all those scripts, I want you to execute this one. And I can put whatever I want in that script. So to go back to a demo, so as you can see, the first part is over in 2 minutes and 27 seconds. If I look now at Azure Portal, you can see here test VM is starting, and we need to wait for all those things to happen with the custom script extension and running that custom script. By the way, the custom script extensions is a part of the extensions, and they, for Azure VMs, they depend on installation of Azure VM agent so that we can extend practically the functionalities and install different features. For example, if you have experience already with Azure VMs, you are aware that every time when you create the Azure VM, when you log into a system, you are greeted with a special wallpaper created by BGInfo extension that it's based on BGInfo sysinternals tool. You also have some other extensions for installing antivirus software, and extension for resetting admin password or setting a RDP connection. So all those things are pretty cool. We will use for this demo just a custom script extension that enable us to run any kind of a PowerShell script that we want. So after that definition of a affinity group, I will move then to storage and define a storage. So also if I go again to a portal and go to a storage, you see here that I will just refresh a page, because sometimes you need to do that in a portal to see the things that happened in the meantime. And you see that I can't remember what's the new one, but one of those is just created by that script. Then I need to create a service. Service is also dependent now on storage. And before I go to this most interesting part, let me go back to a demo just to check a status of my machine. I have a script, and all this demo is based on the work of Michael Green from Microsoft. I modified his scripts for my own needs and to present you what you can do with it. He created all this to demo the capabilities of just enough administration endpoints, the GIA thing, maybe you have heard of it. The Jeffrey Snover created that thing and demoed it already at some conferences at TechEden before, so I used that demo example to create this demo, doing some other configurations and changing the state of my Azure VM. So I will run it just to see how we are going with the status. It needs to check a lot of different things. If you go here to a status, you can see what we are checking. So here I will get information about cloud service, the name, the IP address, port for remote desktop connection, and then we see that the machine is in ready roll state. That's good. The agent is ready, but the resource extension state is transitioning. So that custom script is still in works, right? We need to wait for that one to finish. What I'm doing here is, for a configuration of the actual Azure VM, I need to say that I want it to be present, to give it a name, an image that I will use, So when you work with Azure, you have different images for different operating system. Usually you have like 2 or sometimes even 3 copies with different sets of latest patches. So I picked the latest one for Windows Server 2012 data center, R2 data center. This image is from December. You can see that here, 2014-12. I give it a name here, define a storage. I said that the operating system should be Windows, specify credentials. I want that instance to be small. It means it will have a 1 core, 175 gigabytes of RAM. Then extension container name, it's here, so all the files that I'm putting in that container will be uploaded to that Azure VM. And what I want to execute is a custom script, PS1 script. What's in that script? I put here a few things that you would like to have if you want to work with Azure from this Azure VM. So the first thing that I will need is a NuGet, because with NuGet I can download this Azure resource, because maybe in the future I will use this machine in Azure as my main development machine. So I'm downloading Azure from a Microsoft gallery. Then I need to, because in Azure VM, the PowerShell remoting is enabled over HTTPS, so I need to enable it over HTTP because that's used by DSC as well, and I will need it for some other things. So I'm defining that here. Then I'm downloading the latest PowerShell 5 preview, WMF 5 preview from November, and then I install Azure PowerShell latest version of a module for managing Azure. So all those things should be installed on this machine when that machine is completely ready. So I will check it again with the status PS1 to see if everything is okay there. By now it should be okay. If I go to virtual machines here, it's still provisioning. So I will tell you what we will do. Later we will check the, okay, now it says that everything is fine. So I can use a little bit of, again, PowerShell remoting to check the status of machine and if we were successfully installed all those things. So I will specify a service name and then get information about the connection URI, again using get Azure VM URI commandlet. Create a session option and create a PowerShell session that targets my Azure VM. If everything runs properly, I will have that session in my session variable, and it should be with a state opened. So I can run invoke command and check for PS version table content. Do I have Azure module installed? Do I have resources for Azure installed? And to check a listener for WSMan, practically to see if my PowerShell remoting is enabled also to run over HTTP. So let me run this invoke command. And then we will look at the output of the command. So first, I can see here that PS version is 50983, which is the latest one. I can see that the Azure module is also the latest one, 0813, so that was all successful executed. I have all those DSC resources that belong to Azure DSC, Azure DSC module, and at the end, looking at the keys for a listener, I can see that the transport HTTPS and also HTTP is configured here. So I have both protocols covered, and PowerShell remoting over HTTP is successfully configured on this machine. So everything worked perfectly. If you are interested in log files, so you can execute those commands just targeting the same session. Be aware that if you use this code later, this version might change. So don't target 1.2, target 1.3 maybe, or 4. Be aware of that they have a kind of a history for different versions that you have, so that the logs will belong to a different version if you execute all these things later. The best way to work with DSC in Azure Azure VMs is really to use Azure PowerShell DSC extensions. You've seen in a previous demo that we didn't configure just Azure VM. We configure also some of the Azure resources. Azure PowerShell DSC extension is created to work only with Azure VM. Okay? We will not configure with that any other Azure resource. What's the goal of this? To upload and apply a PowerShell DSC configuration on Azure VM that's enabled with PowerShell DSC extension. So the current version of PowerShell DSC extension is 1.5. It's released in November. And it supports now Windows Server 2012 R2 and Windows Server 2012. That's the change in that version. You need to be careful that when you apply it on your Azure VM, the latest version of PowerShell 5 preview from November will be installed on it. So what happens on a client side when we use a desired state extension, Azure desired state configuration extension? We have a few steps on a client side. First, we have a publishing step. What will happen there? With Azure PowerShell module, we got 4 commandlets for working with desired state configuration extension, and one of them is a publish Azure VM DSC configuration. What will that commandlet do? It will find all dependencies in your configurations, those import DSC resources part of a configuration, and package them together with your configuration in a zip file and uploads that to Azure storage. So that it can be available to any Azure VM that you want to create or to existing one. Then we need to set VM configuration object. For that, we have new commandlet, set Azure VM DSC extension. You know how we work with Azure VM? We first create a VM configuration object locally, setting all the properties, and then we pipe that to new Azure VM or update Azure VM if we update existing one. But first, we configure that object in the memory of a local system. Then we will apply that configuration to a new machine or to existing one. It works with both kinds. What happens on the Azure VM side? The Azure VM agent installs first the PowerShell DSC extension. Then it downloads that package from Azure storage. It executes the specified configuration, because we can have in configuration script more than one configuration, but we can say, okay, execute configuration that says like install IaaS. But next to that one, we can have some configurations that are doing different things. And we will use them probably with some different Azure VMs. It doesn't matter. And then when we have that configuration there, and it's defined and executed, then we will invoke PowerShell DSC by calling start DSC configuration to apply a configuration to Azure VM. By the way, this is not a Photoshop. This is a work of art by a Dutch artist who specialized in creating clouds in rooms. Unbelievable. So we have a get Azure VM available extension commandlet. It's a part of Azure PowerShell module that can give us a list of all extensions that we can use when we work with Azure VMs. Some of them are working with Linux, some of them are working with Windows machines. The ones where we're interested are published by Microsoft PowerShell team, so I will get information about it here, and it says that the version is, as I mentioned, 1.5, PowerShell DSC extension created by team. You have some legal information, some links and stuff there. To work with DSC extension, you need to have Azure PowerShell module that it's newer than 1.8.5. So you need 1.8.6 or newer. The latest one is 1.8.13. So looking at the commands that are exposed that are containing a DSC string in the noun, I got this nice output when I combined it with the synopsis from a help files. So you can see that I have 4 commandlets for supporting work with DSC extensions. Get Azure VM DSC extension, a publish one that I already mentioned, remove for removing DSC extension from Azure VM, and set Azure VM DSC extension for setting configuration object before we update it or create a new one. So I have here a very simple configuration for installing web server. What I will do now, I will first check if my Azure subscription is still okay. It is. I'm connected, I'm authenticated, and I will use now publish Azure DSC configuration to create a zip file. And to upload it to Azure storage. You can see here in the output the path when it went. If I want to see the content of it, I can use a configuration archive path and store it locally on my system. So if I look now at the content of a zip file, I can see that it contains only a configuration script with my IaaS install configuration, nothing else. I will define here a name for my new VM and execute this one-liner. You can see it's in a 5 lines, right? But it's a one-liner. So first, I will define that configuration object, setting a name, a size for it, the image that should be used, then some provisioning configuration. It's a Windows, admin name, password. Then I would add endpoints for port 80 and map that to a local port 80 because I'm installing a web server and I want to have access from my local machine to that one as well. And this is the thing that it's new, right? So set Azure VM DSC extension will set a property on that configuration object pointing to that zip file that should be used, and then a name of actual configuration from that zip file that we want to use. Because I'm creating a new one, I will use a new Azure VM, specify location for it, the name of a service, and wait for boot. So I will execute all this. And then while we wait for this thing to boot, I will go to, so we can just check the status here. We have check a portal to see if it's already visible. So it's still not visible here. Okay. While I wait for that one to configure, I can move to a machine that I created before using absolutely the same command. I just changed the name for a service and for a machine. So let me try to do this. I need to open a new PowerShell tab. Let me check Azure subscription here. I don't expect that to work right now, so I will need to authenticate from this run space, from this session. Need to wait a little. Maybe it's busy with this one. This one succeeded. Maybe I can even continue here if I wait a little bit longer. Let me check here. Okay, true. Things are working, so I can continue here and get the information from the machine that it's, as I said, completely the same as the one that we are just building. So that agent is ready and accepting on this one. I can check the status of a VM extension and check what configuration is applied here. And you can see that I'm not cheating. Configuration function is the same. Install IaaS install PS1 with the configuration IaaS install. So this machine is the same as the one we are just building. There's another way to check for a status. We can use WinRM to do all this stuff. PowerShell remoting connection to it. And I will try now to look at what's waiting for me there. And you can see default installation of a web server on that test VM3 machine. So what I can do now is I can apply a new configuration to existing machine. So let me go to this window here. So I have a configuration script called NIC. And in that NIC configuration script, I have a little bit more advanced configuration of a web server. I'm adding a content as well. So you see that I have lots of different things. And I have another one. So I want just to show you that your configuration script can contain more than one configuration. But I will publish this NIC one, and it's already published on Azure Storage. But I will publish it here locally just to see. It doesn't work because I need to go to a proper folder. Just a second. So here, CD 2000, NIC, and then CD demo. It's here. If I look what's here, I can see now that I have a configuration script, but I also have some additional DSC resources that I need. So as I mentioned before, that publish commandlet, look for all those import DSC resource commands and added DSC resource modules to this zip file so that it can be used. So when you want to update your existing machine, you will first reference to that machine, then set DSC configuration, saying like, okay, this is the zip file that I want to use that contains the configuration, and this is the configuration for that configuration script that I want to use, and then update Azure VM. So if I run this, then that additional configuration will be now applied to that new machine. I don't want to wait for it, so I prepared already a machine called Plan B, because all those things are happening at the same time, and as you can see, we need to wait a little for those machines to boot properly. So what I have here is practically the same thing up to here for configuring a public port and names and admin credentials and all those things. Then I'm setting that NIC configuration on it, wait for it to boot, and if everything is properly configured on this one, what will I get here is I can go directly to a browser, and just to check, I will need H here. What I got is a NIC website, published with a DSC, fully blown NIC website. Isn't that amazing? From the comfort of my local machine. So a little bit of credits at the end. The demo images, this is the name, I cannot pronounce it really, but that's the Dutch artist that created those cool photos of clouds in nice rooms. Michael Green blog post that I used for inspiration for one of the demos. PowerShell team blog and PowerShell magazine articles that are also covering the Azure specific topics. I have a question here.
Yeah, just checked my notes from the past, and I don't know if they've fixed that. The publish Azure DSC extension stuff, zipping up all the custom resources you need. It doesn't know about composite resources, or it didn't used to know about composite resources.
I remember that there were some problems with it, but I don't think that's fixed. I really don't know. I didn't use it for any of my demos composite resources, so I don't have experience with it.
Yeah, it didn't work in my demos.
Yeah. It might, maybe we will get it with a 1.6 version of it. Any more questions? No? Thank you for coming. This is the end of this presentation and very close end of the whole conference, right? Because we are in the final slot for it. I hope you had a great time during this conference. The NIC conference is always very enjoyable, and I really appreciate you being here. Thank you.
Don't forget to vote.
Yeah.